Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading into the woods for a collection of camping stories. So, best be prepared. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was younger, I had a terrifying experience while camping near a riverbed. Our campsite was located a few hundred feet away from the river, and my family's tent was just a few yards to our left. Little did we know that a dreadful surprise awaited us when we woke up. As we emerged from our slumber, we realized with a sinking feeling in the pit of our stomach that our tent was filling with water. It's hard to describe the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over us. With a mix of panic and urgency, I quickly unzipped the tent, only to find ourselves standing in about 4 inches of water. The situation escalated rapidly as our tent, seemingly possessed by the rushing river, was torn from its mooring and floated away into the darkness of the night. We called out desperately for our parents, who sprang into action and emerged from their own tent, which was also being carried away by the powerful current. My mother's cries of our names mingled with the chaos as my father initially prepared to swim for our disappearing tent, only to realize that we were all out safely. Without missing a beat, we sprinted through the campground, our hearts pounding in our chest. With each step we took, the water level seemed to rise, the ground beneath our feet disappearing beneath the restless torrent. By the time we reached higher ground, the river had surged to our knees, and the surrounding scene was one of devastation. Trees were being uprooted and swept away by the roaring river, while the playground and picnic tables had been destroyed, carried off by the unforgiving current. The only remnants left standing were the grills firmly anchored to the ground. Tragically, there were casualties from the flash flood, although not at the campground we were at. Some individuals had parked their trailers next to the riverbank, and a few were tragically swept away. The danger was immense. Once the water rose, even a 3-foot-high trailer would be carried a quarter of a mile downstream before its occupants had a chance to react. The morning after the ordeal, the campground lay in ruins, bearing witness to the destructive power of nature's fury. It was a sobering reminder of how swiftly and mercilessly our surroundings can change. 2 years ago, I embarked on a visit family in northern Minnesota during Labor Day weekend. My girlfriend and I were eagerly anticipating a serenic camping trip with her family, hoping for a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. Arriving at our destination around noon on Saturday, we were warmly greeted by everyone. As the day transitioned into evening, we immersed ourselves in various enjoyable activities, catching up with each other's lives. The hours passed by until we found ourselves huddled around the campfire until 11 p.m. Eventually, both of our families retired for the night and made their way to their respective sleeping quarters. Mary, one of my girlfriend's relatives, kindly offered us a spacious 6-person tent earlier in the day, since we only brought a smaller 2-person tent. It was a thoughtful gesture, and we appreciated the extra room for our belongings and air mattress. Mary's tent was positioned not too far from the campfire, nestled among the trees. The family had done an excellent job of the clearing and maintaining the area, accommodating their smaller RVs and traditional tents. The 3 of us lay there chatting until we eventually drifted off to sleep. However, sleep eluded me, and I resorted to passing the time on my phone, hoping exhaustion would eventually take over. That's when I noticed faint activity in the woods about 40 yards away. I dismissed it, attributing the sound to deer, as they are known for frequenting the area. Engrossed in my phone, I continued to distract myself, perusing random things online. However, after 10 or 20 minutes, the noise grew closer, piquing my curiosity. The snapping of twigs and rustling amongst the bushes became more distinct, gradually advancing towards our tent and the clearing. At this point, I could feel a subtle tremor in the ground, as if something sizable were traversing the area. Moments later, the enigmatic presence was merely 10 yards away from our tent, pacing back and forth with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine, each step reverberating through the earth akin to the thumping of a drum at a rock concert. Fear began to consume me as I strained to trace the footsteps that darted around the rear side of our tent. Then, the entity came within 5 yards of our tent before stopping abruptly near Mary's side. An indescribable dread overwhelmed me as I braced for what might happen next. Suddenly, Mary jolted upright from a deep slumber, gasping for air and calling out our names in a voice riddled with terror. The entity retreated into the woods, leaving both of us startled and shaken. The forest fell eerily silent after gathering our courage, and we cautiously peered outside the tent. There was no sight or sound to be found, and 30 minutes later we bolted to their shop to retrieve a shotgun. After this, we remained on high alert. Mary recounted that during the time I was awake, she had experienced a dream. She claimed that malevolent entities were tormenting her relentlessly, demanding her soul or seeking to end her life. My girlfriend dismissed it as a mere product of her imagination, suggesting it was probably just a deer or some other harmless creature romping around. Faced with my girlfriend's rationalization, I chose to keep this eerie incident to myself, refraining from sharing it with anyone until now. As I contemplate the events more, I couldn't help but wonder about the true nature of the enigmatic entity that disturbed our peaceful camping trip. When I was growing up in Rose Meadow, a suburb in Sydney's southwest Australia, my friends and I spent a lot of time exploring the local bushland. While the area had its rough reputation, we made the most of our surrounding and enjoyed our childhood adventures. The bushland was our playground, where we rode bikes, built tree swings and caught frogs. We were quite familiar with the terrain and felt at home in its natural beauty. However, there was always an eerie element to the bushland due to its proximity with the Kilbride nursing home, located on a hill to the west. Security personnel patrolled the area often, chasing us away from that particular section of bush. Behind the nursing home, we discovered unfinished structures that resembled catacombs. These concrete foundations featured cave-like, half-dirt, half-brick structures. It seemed like people had used them for hangout spots, or even made makeshift shelters as we stumbled upon remnants like canned food, old bongs, and discarded clothes. Fast forward to 2013 when I was 14. Curiosity got the better of us, and my friends and I hatched a plan to pitch a tent in the bushland away from the nursing home and security patrols. We purchased an affordable tent and set off to our chosen spot, making sure to arrive before sunset. Excited and naive, we indulged in our first experience with marijuana, keeping our plans a secret from everyone, including our parents. As night fell, we gathered around a small fire, each taking a hit from the bong. While my friends engaged in a lively conversation, my heightened senses detected a presence nearby. I became increasingly aware of rustling sounds in the distance, triggering a sense of paranoia. In an attempt to silence my friends, I abruptly shushed them. Before I could finish my sentence, a chilling voice pierced in the darkness, shouting, "I know where you are." The voice had an unsettling, cracking quality to it. Shocked, we exchanged glances, confirming we'd all heard it. Feeling a mix of fear and curiosity, we instinctively sprinted back towards the nursing home, our instincts overriding any desire to investigate further. As we ran through the valley, I caught a glimpse of a dark silhouette resembling a cloaked figure perched on top of the unfinished structures. Though intrigued, I chose not to dwell on it and continued running. Finally, we reached the bushland's exit. We breathed a sigh of relief and looked back only to witness a white apparition emerging at the bottom of the hill, heading in our direction. Filled with a sense of urgency, we sprinted back to my house, which was conveniently nearby. We all shared the same bewildered and terrified experience, confirming the reality of what we had encountered. That night, we opted to stay at my house, reluctant to venture back into the bush until daylight. The following day, we returned to the tent to clear up our belongings. Despite the previous night's unsettling encounter, we couldn't resist the allure of the bushlands during daylight hours. While playing near a tree swing about 15 meters from where our tent had been, we were startled by a blood-curdling scream that appeared to be that of a young girl, followed by the revving sound of a chainsaw. We peered through the dense shrubbery, unable to see much beyond the thick vegetation. The location seemed inaccessible with no clear path or flat ground. Filled with fear, we ran back to my house, enlisting my dad's help to bring along our dog to search the area. Interestingly, as we reached my house, we encountered an old man of Chinese descent riding a bike wearing a bucket as a makeshift helmet. This eccentric sight had always amused me. However, as we had seen the man around town before, this time his presence near my house felt unsettling. The way he looked at me made me feel uneasy, adding to the strange events we had experienced. With my dog in tow, we ventured back to the bushlands hoping to find some answers, but despite our efforts we found no trace of the girl or any indication of a chainsaw-wielding maniac. These experiences left me perplexed and questioning my own sanity. Were we all collectively experiencing some sort of shared psychosis? And what did the role of the enigmatic Chinese man in the bucket play in all of this, if any? The truth remains elusive to this day. The events were undeniably strange, and the presence of the dark energies or entities connected to the nursing home added to the mystery. If anyone hearing this has any similar encounters in the Rosemeadow bushland, I would appreciate hearing your stories, and perhaps together we can shed some light on these inexplicable phenomena. My boyfriend Jason and I went on a month-long camping trip to multiple states. Everything had been going really well until October 9th. We decided to ditch a campground reservation and randomly pitch our tent near Albion Basin within the Uinta Mountains. It was the Secret Lake Trailhead, or not far from it. We parked our car around 3 p.m. at the Albion Basin campground, closed for some reason. Admittedly, I was a little tense because this was our first dispersed camping attempt, as we had no proper backpacking gear. Upon arrival, we realized the area we wanted to pitch our tent in was 2 miles uphill. At this point, we started to express regret, as we had a planned campsite in Nepi, Utah, which we decided to skip on a whim. After grumping around a bit and having a large lunch to avoid packing food, we packed our backpacks with the best gear we had to get through the night, as it was going to be around 25 Fahrenheit. We set up the trail, seeing the occasional family or couple heading down the mountain. As we trudged on, we both started to feel strange, as if we did not really even know why we were doing this, as if we should have just gotten a hotel instead of trying to play backpackers for the night. But we both felt like we had something to prove, so we continued. Fast forward, we made it up to Secret Lake, totally empty, so nothing like the pictures, disappointing and eerie. Whatever. We kept hiking up in an attempt for seclusion and flat land, when we stumble across a decent space. I see a small cave in the distance and pointed out to Jason to debate if it's a hell no kind of situation, but after he checks it out, he says it seems like a small animal crawl space, no biggie. We set it up as nightfall was quickly approaching, play some cards, bundle up, and decide to go to bed early around 8:30 p.m. as we planned to leave ASAP in the morning at around 5 a.m. We both dwindle slowly, and after what feels like half an hour, I woke up abruptly at 11:24. I woke up with a feeling that I've never experienced before. I woke up wide awake, scared but unprovoked, as if there was no way in hell I was going to fall back asleep. When I was sleeping through the night, Jason was asleep, so I let him be and just lie there, trying to listen to anything I could hear, which was nothing, just very silent. Around midnight, Jason woke up stirring, much to my delight, as I did not want to feel alone anymore. I told him I could not sleep, but he suggested I just rest my eyes as we were leaving early in the morning. I agreed, initially not wanting to be a baby and say that I was very scared. This was very short-lived, as Jason could not fall back asleep himself, and we ended up just laying together trying to sleep, when I ended up blurting out that I was scared. We agreed it's fine for us to just stick it through the night, as it was approaching 2:30 a.m, and we had a small hand axe and a pellet gun for protection, so we need not be frightened. Not 5 minutes later, we're wide awake when Jason's head perks up super fast that my heart jumped out of my chest and I whispered, "What is it?" "Listen." I kid you not. We distinctly heard the sound of gravel crunching under boots, as if someone walked up to our tent, stopped and then walked to the other side of it. I felt the blood drain out my face in an instant. In real time, this all occurred in no more than 10 seconds, but my mind flashed up a million thoughts, and for a millisecond I was convinced it was a ranger coming to tell us we couldn't camp there, so I called out, "Hello?" My brain entirely sure I heard a human footstep. Within 2 to 3 seconds of hearing the footstep, Jason grabbed the gun and burst through the tent in order for a chance to confront this person, as I knew he had heard exactly what I did. But there was nothing at all. As soon as Jason burst out, and me after him, there was nothing there. We heard something walk up so clearly, but nothing walked away. Hardly exchanging 2 words, we packed up our stuff, looking over our shoulders terrified, feeling watched, and booked it down the mountain with only moonlight guiding our way. Too scared to turn on our flashlights, this was the worst 20 to 30 minutes of my life, half expecting to look over my shoulder to find someone following us. When we made it to our car, we locked the doors and started the descent out of the mountains, almost speechless and scared out of our minds. At this point, we reached town at around 3:30 a.m. and slept in a well-lit parking lot of a grocery store. We have obviously since discussed what happened that night and are both haunted by the sounds of those footsteps. My husband and I made a decision to camp in a secluded campground where no one else seemed to be around. As we arrived, we noticed that the gate to the area was strangely open and the place appeared deserted. It was early in the season, March to be exact, and we assumed that the gate had been accidentally left open. Despite this, we thought it might be a unique opportunity to enjoy some peaceful moments in a typically crowded campground. During the night, our slumber was abruptly interrupted by unsettling noises. To our surprise and alarm, 2 trucks with their headlights on pulled into the camp and individuals hopped out of their beds wielding flashlights. Fear washed over us as we contemplated the intentions of the unexpected visitors. It may sound irrational, but we couldn't help but worry about the possibility of them finding us and causing harm. For me, it's the actions of fellow humans that can be even more unnerving than the unpredictability of nature. With trepidation, we watched as they wandered around the area for a while, their flashlights scanning the surroundings. Fortunately, they eventually returned to their trucks and departed without spotting our tent nestled among the trees towards the back of the campground. But let me tell you, the scare we experienced left us on high alert and ready to pack up and leave at a moment's notice. While it's possible they were merely checking out the campground with intention to stay, the whole atmosphere felt eerie and unsettling, as if they were searching for something in particular. One time, my buddy and I were camping around Diamond Lake in Oregon. I can't remember the exact name of the site, but it was around that area. This was the off-season, and we were the only really ones camping around this lake. It was pitch black out there, and with the exception of our campfire, it was just pure darkness. So around 1 in the morning, we're just chilling and smoking. The area we were at had a hill just above us with a lot of trees and bushes on it. We're sitting there when we start hearing a crackling sound and then a huge crash, and something sounding like it's rolling, and then another huge smash. We get the flashlight on looking up at the hill, and all we can see is dust and debris falling everywhere. We totally freak the hell out. We don't know what happened, but we decide to go to bed. The next morning when we woke up, we noticed a gigantic old dead tree that had fallen and started rolling down the hill. You could see where it had broken off the hill and rolled away, breaking smaller trees along its path. It was probably about 30 feet tall and big and chunky. It was completely sideways and only stopped by 3 other trees that held it back up the hill. It could have rolled right through our campsite if the other trees hadn't have stopped it. And honestly, it's one of the most disturbing moments of my life, knowing how close we could have been to death had the situations gone any other way. During a camping trip in North Dakota, We had a remarkable encounter with a group of wild bison that wandered into our campsite. The ranger informed us that such encounters were not common in the area. However, what made this particular encounter unique was the sight that greeted us: a deceased coyote dangling from one of the massive male bison's horns. It turns out that coyotes, in their pursuit of an easy meal, sometimes attempt to prey on young bison calves, taking advantage of any perceived vulnerability. In this case, it seems the bison had successfully defended its young from a coyote attack, as evidenced by the coyote's unfortunate demise, impaled on the bison's horn. Despite the unconventional ornament adorning its head, it seemed unperturbed by the coyote carcass hanging from it. It appeared to be carrying on with its usual grazing, and undisturbed by it. While it may have been tempting for some of us to intervene to remove the coyote remains, it could have been a dangerous thing to attempt. One evening in the dark heart of the forest on my family's land, we gathered around a crackling fire, enjoying the tranquility of the wilderness, when suddenly the stillness was shattered by a piercing, blood-curdling noise that echoed through the trees. Compelled by curiosity and concern, we followed the eerie sound towards the bank of the nearby river. Illuminating the scene with our flashlights, a heart-wrenching sight unfolded before our eyes. A deer trapped in the treacherous sand and mud found itself at the mercy of a pack of hungry wolves, tearing it to shreds. Witnessing the scene was a mix of emotions: sadness, compassion for the suffering animal, and the awe and raw power of the instinctual predator. The experience left me with a profound sense of both fragility and resilience of life in the wilderness, and a reminder that the delicate balance exists in nature. About 17 years ago, my cross-country team and I had the opportunity to visit Yosemite National Park. It was an exciting adventure, and we set up camp in a populated area. To no one's surprise, the sleeping arrangements turned out to be separate tents for girls and boys. My thoughtful grandma had gotten me a small tent of my own, very luckily. Sleeping has never come easy to me when I was younger. Throughout our week-long stay, several interesting incidents occurred. One evening, a bear strolled by my tent, which was quite a memorable encounter, and on another occasion I heard a distinct sound of a woman screaming, and it startled both me and the girls in the neighboring tent. However, there was one peculiar night that stands out in my memory. I heard splashing and rustling noises coming from the nearby lake, leading me to assume it was just another bear or some other animal. Out of curiosity, I decided to investigate, although I now realize it might not have been the safest idea. Armed with my flashlight, I pointed it in the direction of the sounds and caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a person, but not quite. This figure was small in stature and lacked any clothing. It moved swiftly, darting behind the trees before disappearing from sight. Feeling unsettled, I promptly retreated to the safety of my tent, thankful I didn't encounter anything else like that for the remainder of our trip. Rock Island is a state park located at the tip of Door County, Wisconsin on Lake Michigan. It's a difficult place to get to. To get to Rock Island, you have to take a car ferry from Ellison Bay to Washington Island and drive across Washington Island to Jackson Harbor, then take a pedestrian-only ferry to Rock Island, as there are no vehicles or bikes allowed. Even though the island is relatively small, at about 975 acres, it has a very rich and interesting history. In the early 1600s, it was inhabited by a tribe of Potawatomi Native Americans, as well as a small fishing village of European settlers. The two groups did not trust each other, and did have a few bad encounters that almost led to violence, but for the most part, they lived peacefully together on the island. By the year 1640, the Potawatomi had migrated to other parts of Wisconsin. Shortly after they'd left, some settlers from the fishing village reported seeing a new group of people on the island. They seemed to be more white settlers, but they wore strange clothes and kept to themselves. No one from the fishing village was able to talk to one of these new settlers or even find where they were living. It was around that time that strange things began to occur on the island. Several animals, it was not mentioned what they were, maybe pigs or chickens that were kept by the settlers, were found slaughtered in the village and seemed to have been used to mark in blood some of the buildings on the village. On a different night, a building used for preserving meat burnt down. The villagers felt like these things must have been done by the new people on the island, and they intended to find them. But after a thorough search of the island, included the wooded inland area, they never found a single person. These strange occurrences seemed to stop soon after the search, and none of the other settlers were ever seen again. In 1836, the Potawatomi Lighthouse was built on the northern part of the island. After construction was finished, the lighthouse was inspected, and it was reported to be that the material of the lighthouse and dwelling were made of the best quality, and it was reported that the work was done very well. David E. Corbin was appointed the first keeper of the light on December 19, 1837. Only 3 years later, in 1840, despite the apparent quality of construction of the lighthouse, he started to complain that plaster began falling off the building and some sort of liquid would ooze through the cracks, leaving the house constantly damp. Corbin was completely alone most of the time at the lighthouse, and some have said that when visiting him, he would stare at certain parts of the wall and spoke vaguely to the other visitors. In 1845, after 8 years of relative solitude at the lighthouse, an inspector visited the lighthouse keeper and determined that while Corbin was fulfilling his duties, he was acting strangely. The official report stated that the inspector ordered Corbin to take a 25-day leave of absence to find a wife to live with him at the lighthouse. However, something that the inspector noticed was Corbin's mental state. He thought that by years of solitude, it would be best that he spent some time away from the island. In 1852, Corbin reportedly fell ill and died that December in the lighthouse. He was buried in a small cemetery just south of the lighthouse. The next lighthouse keeper also reported the surprising quick deterioration of the lighthouse. Some friends that he had visit say that he would talk of seeing strange things in the lighthouse at night, but he would never elaborate on what. In 1858, after only 22 years of service, the original lighthouse was torn down and a new one was built. From that point on, the lighthouse keepers were required to have an assistant keeper or a family with them at the lighthouse. No strange occurrences were further reported in the lighthouse logbook outside of some strong storms and occasional shipwrecks, except on January 20th, 1876. The keeper at the time, named Betts, reported that he saw 2 men attempting to row to the mainland from Washington Island. He wrote that a terrible storm came up shortly after they departed, and they never made it to their destination. Over 3 months later, on May 3rd, 1876, Bett wrote, 2 men who were lost in January have been seen several times, once from Caney Lighthouse and once from Jacksonport. The men were allegedly frozen stiff and sitting upright in the boat among a mass of ice. At last account, they were still adrift. There's not much hope they will be found and buried. By 1900, most of the island's inhabitants left for better fishing areas on Lake Michigan. In 1910, a successful business owner and inventor, Chester Thordarson, purchased all of the island except for the land that the lighthouse occupied in the north. He used the island as a private summer retreat for his business in Chicago. Thordarson is responsible for the unique and mystifying buildings and structures that are still on the island today. On the south end of the island, he built a giant stone hall that has a boathouse on the lower level. A stone water tower was built on the east side of the island, and an imposing wooden gate was constructed on the west end of the island. The Great Hall was used to store his immense book collection. He had over 11,000 books, and it was rumored that he possessed some very rare books in the occult in his collection. He died of heart failure on January 6, 1945, though some have speculated that he saw something that actually scared him to death. After his death, multiple churches and universities were interested in his collection, but he had willed it to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, providing that they had to purchase it for $300,000, which they did. Some of this history was hard to find on the internet, but there are a few binders in the Great Hall that has a lot of this documented. His personal archive and papers are housed in the archives section of the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. This history was important to provide to give context for the experience I had on the island. In August of 2021, I took my first and last trip to Rock Island. After taking 2 ferry rides, I arrived on the island at 2 p.m. I had booked a remote campsite, which is called E, in the backpacking site that's just over a little of a mile away from the dock. I took my time on the hike, out on the site to enjoy the scenery, and took a few breaks just due to how heavy my pack was. It was definitely packed more for camping than hiking. I got to my site, set up my tent, got everything situated, and started gathering sticks and driftwood from the beach so that I could start a fire. On my 3rd trip back from the beach, before I got back to my site, I heard a single high-pitched squeal noise coming from the forest. It didn't sound close, but it was such an unusual sound that I stopped in my tracks and waited for a good 30 seconds, waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't, so I continued back to my site. When I got back, I began working on getting a fire started. The remote camping site on Rock Island are pretty well spaced out, so sites C, D, and E are grouped together, but there's probably 100 yards between each. There's not a real trail connecting the 3 sites directly, but enough people have walked along the ridge between the 3 sites that there's an obvious path. As I was setting some sticks up in my fire ring, something caught my eye. I looked up, and fairly far away, it looked like it may have been at site D or a little further, was a person running in my direction. My first thought was, well, that's odd, because like I said, it's not really a very traily trail. Then in my mind, there must have been something wrong, like the person needed help. As they grew closer, and it looked like maybe they were a woman in loose grey clothes, perhaps a hoodie, it was still too far away for me to tell. I quickly stood up from the crouching position I was in, and just as I did, I heard a high-pitched squeal noise. It was behind me and it was much closer. This startled me quite a bit, so I turned around to look behind me. I scanned the trees for a few seconds but didn't see or hear a thing. I turned back around because I knew the running person must be getting close, but now they were gone. I stood there, scanned the trees, but did not see them anywhere. I was so confused, I was kind of frozen for a few moments. It was all very strange, but I was able to reason it out of my head that I was just a fellow camper from Site C or D, and that maybe they were running to the pit toilet that was a few 100 yards west of the sites. I tried to forget about it all, but it was really just bothering me. I did not like whatever that squeal noise was, and it just felt strange. With some effort, I decided to let it go and started my fire. I had a quick meal and a couple of adult beverages, then decided to take a little walk. I hadn't seen Site C or D yet, so I thought I would check those out to see if I had any neighbors camping nearby. But Site D was empty. I did see the path that led from the site to the main trail and the pit toilet, so that made me feel a little less uneasy about the runner. I figured it was maybe someone from Site C that took a strange way to get to the main trail by going through Site D. It didn't make a ton of sense because I probably still should have seen them, but it made me feel better. I continued on to Site C and saw there was a tent set up. I really didn't want to bother anyone, but I thought I would just go over with the excuse that I would introduce myself as a camping neighbor from Site E and see if anyone looked like they might have been the person running earlier. I came upon the site and there was a couple sitting at the picnic table. Neither of them looked like they would have been the person I saw running. I introduced myself and they introduced themselves. They were probably in their mid-30s, were very nice and both seemed pretty drunk, but a quiet drunk. I didn't ask about the runner. or the squealing noises because I thought it might be weird. I wished them all a good night and walked back to my tent. When I got back, I had a cigar and a few more drinks. It got dark, and it started as a perfect night. The sky was clear, and I was staring up looking at millions of stars. I felt better about everything from earlier and felt stupid about the whole thing and decided to get some sleep. It was a long day, so I fell asleep almost immediately. But around 2:30 a.m., I was awoken by a huge boom of thunder. It started downpouring. The wind picked up and the temperature dropped considerably. I love camping in the rain, but I do not like camping in a lightning storm. A pretty big storm came through, and I was starting to worry. The wind was ripping around my tent, and the ground was shaking from the thunder and lightning. I did not feel good about being out there in the tent, and felt very exposed. The storm lasted for about an hour before it became just a light, steady drizzle. I was about to start falling back asleep when I heard the squeal noise again. I opened my eyes up wide in the dark and just lay there silent. There was another loud squeal noise and it was pretty close. I knew there was no real dangerous animals on Rock Island. There were deer and porcupines, but nothing like bears or wolves. Knowing that still didn't make me feel any better though. There was just something about the squeal that I didn't like. I say squeal because it's the best way I can describe it. It sounded to me like a pig squeal. Honestly, don't know that much about pig noises, but that's what I thought of when I heard it. An injured or angry pig squeal. I continued to lay in my tent when I started to hear footsteps outside of it. It was still raining, so the sounds were a little buried in the sound of rain, but it definitely sounded like a somewhat large animal or human walking around. I sat up in my tent and took a knife I had out just to feel better. In my head, I just kept saying, "You know, it's just an animal, it's fine. There's nothing here that can hurt you." I listened as the footsteps began retreating from my tent, and I just sat there, still holding the knife for maybe 10 minutes without hearing anything. That's when I began thinking to myself, it's fine. It was just an animal, you're being silly. And you need to get some sleep. I was just about to lay back down when there was a very loud squeal, and it was right outside my tent. It felt like my heart just stopped, and a shiver went down my spine. My heart was beating so hard my entire body was pulsing, and I felt it in my ears. It took everything in me, but I forced a "get out of here" from my mouth. Not shouting, but as stern and mean-sounding as I could in that moment. I didn't hear any more squeals or footsteps that night, but I also didn't sleep. I just sat there in my tent for maybe an hour before I lay down. Eventually the rain stopped, and I kept laying there until the sun came up. All that time reassuring myself that I was being stupid. It was just an animal. It was probably 7 a.m. before I decided I had to get out of my tent to relieve myself, and as soon as I stepped outside, I saw that my picnic table had been turned over and was upside down. When I saw this, I was surprisingly calm and thought, okay, this is enough, I'm leaving the island today. I checked my surroundings, and nothing else seemed out of place. I eventually reasoned with myself that the wind had blown the table over during the storm. It still seemed a little strange because the table was pretty heavy, and I felt like I would have heard the table flipping over, but that might have made sense. I made some cold instant coffee, had a bite to eat and started to feel better about the whole thing, and decided to go for a hike. I admit I get scared easily when I'm camping by myself in the woods. Maybe that's natural. After I had some coffee and food, the sun came out, and I realized I hadn't heard or seen anything really that couldn't be explained away. The reason I came to the island in the first place was the 7-mile Thordarson Loop trail that had a lot of interesting things to see, and I was excited to start the hike. I packed a few things in my backpack and started off. Fairly close to my site is the water tower. I have no idea how it originally worked or why it had to be a tower, but it's an impressive building with a fireplace that looks like someone had recently had a fire in it. A little further down the trail was a cemetery, where 2 sisters and a few others are buried. It's believed that there are still more buried here in unmarked graves. These likely are some of the settlers from the old fishing village. The island has 3 cemeteries. There is one by the beach. That's where Chester Thorderson is buried. There's one on the eastern part of the island, where the two sisters are buried, and there's one on the northern part of the island, where the original lighthouse keeper, David E. Corbin, is buried. There is also at least one Potawatomi burial area on the island, but no one knows where that is exactly. I kept walking the trail until I came to a nice scenic overlook area with a bench where I just sat down and drank some water. I started to hear some talking on the trail ahead of me, but couldn't see anyone yet. There was a bend in the trail, and the trees were thick, so I sat on the bench waiting for these people to come around the bend. The voices were coming closer, and I could tell that they weren't speaking English but couldn't place what language it might have been. Both voices were very deep and guttural. Then, back deep in the woods, I hear a quick and loud "ooh." Immediately, both the voices I was listening to responded with their own "ooh." I kind of smiled because it sounded like these two heard whatever it was in the woods and they were trying to make fun of respond to it. I got off the bench, put on my backpack, and started walking in the direction further down the trail where the voices were coming from, but I never did find these people. The rest of the hike went very well. I visited the cemetery where David E. Corbin was buried. I took a self-guided tour of the lighthouse, and I passed the wooden gate that apparently used to be part of a larger construction. I walked by the great hall and dock area from where I arrived on the island, visited some of the other structures on it, and came across the cemetery where Chester Thorderson was buried. Then finished the loop by returning to my campsite. It was a very nice hike with a lot to see, and it wasn't especially difficult, but I was tired. I did walk down to campsite C to ask the couple I'd spoken to the night before how they fared in the storm, but then realized that they had gone. I was disappointed because I also really wanted to ask them about the squealing noises during the night. The rest of the evening was pretty uneventful. I built a fire, made some meals, had a cigar, and some drinks. As soon as it got dark, I was ready for bed. Since I had so little sleep the night before, I got in my tent and quickly fell asleep. I might have been asleep for about 3 hours when I awoke suddenly and was immediately on full alert. Nothing that I was aware of caused me to wake up, but I felt like something was wrong. I sat up in my tent, and this part is a little hard to explain. A feeling of complete dread washed over me. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It felt like there was something in the tent with me. I could feel that it was angry, seething with rage, anger, and I could feel its hatred for me. It felt like something bad was about to happen. I couldn't do anything about it, and I started to shiver uncontrollably. There was a smell of garbage or rotten meat, and it got stronger and stronger to the point where I wanted to throw up, but I couldn't because I was frozen. I had never felt so exposed and helpless. I stared forwards at nothing, just frozen. And the weird thing is, I accepted whatever was about to happen to me. It was like my brain was telling me that whatever was about to happen, even if it's death, would at least be a relief. Then I passed out. At least I assumed I did. All I remember is I woke up at 8 a.m. that morning. When I woke up, I was laying outside of my sleeping bag on top of it, and my legs were in an unnatural and uncomfortable position. I was on my back, with my legs straight out, and my right leg was bent so that my foot was now against my left knee. I packed up everything very quickly and started back towards the dock to catch the first boat off the island. Since the first boat from Washington Island doesn't arrive until 10:30, I had a little time to kill and looked around the great hall and docking area. I wanted to get off the island so badly, but I did feel a little better just being out of the woods so I could see other people. I sat down on a bench a little to the east of the dock and lit a cigar just to give me something to do while trying not to think about the night before. I was sitting just a few minutes and scanning out over the water when I was startled by someone behind me saying, "Hi." I jumped and was embarrassed when the person came around saying, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. I just saw you smoking and wanted to ask if you had a lighter." I felt like an idiot and told him it was fine. I just didn't sleep well last night and kinda zoned out. I handed him my lighter and he thanked me. He lit a cigarette, then handed the lighter back. We began talking about the usual things you may speak about. He said he was from the Madison area, and we talked about the storms we've been having. He seemed to be a real outdoorsy kind of guy, and talked about his plans to move to Washington Island. It was a nice, normal conversation, and kind of took my mind off the night just for a bit. He seemed pretty nice. Then naturally he asked me about what site I had been staying at. I told him I was staying at Site E the last 2 nights, and he says he usually books that site, but I must have reserved it before him. He said he booked Site D the last 2 nights, and I was surprised by this because no tent or anything was at Site D the 2 times I walked past. I told him this, and he says he comes to the island a few times a year, and you have to book a site, but he actually camps at different areas on the island. I asked him where he camps, and he told me that most of the time he camps in the East Cemetery, but he also likes to camp in the woods south of the lighthouse. He told me he hikes about halfway down the Fernwood Trail and just heads north into the woods and finds a place to camp. He shared with me that he once found the ruins of a small log house in those woods, and that he's going to try and find it again and camp inside of it. At this point I started to change my opinion about this guy and wanted to change the subject, but then he asked me if I had heard the screeches in the woods. I took a second to reply, as I knew he was talking about the squealing I'd heard. I told him I had, and asked him if he knew what it was. This time he took a second to reply. I saw his face change. He looked as if he was thinking if he should tell me something like a secret. With no expression at all on his face, he said matter-of-factly, "A demon lives on this island." Under any other circumstance I would have laughed this off, but not after what I experienced the night before. He looked at me, and must have seen the anxiety and fear I was feeling. He surprised me by letting out a quick laugh. He asked me if I saw anything that night, and I told him I hadn't seen anything, and he stared at me like he was trying to figure something out. I felt like he could tell I had experienced something. At this point I was ready for the conversation to be over. He told me he had seen something in the cemetery that night. Now his face and mood kind of changed again, like he was trying to confide in me. I really didn't want to ask the question, but I knew he wanted me to ask it, so I asked him what he saw. My voice was shaky. Then I could tell he changed his mind about telling me. He actually looked at me with empathy and told me what he saw was hard to explain, but if I was afraid of the screeching noises, he didn't think I should go near the cemetery. I didn't say anything right away, but he said 4 words without any context. Keepers of the Flame. I looked at my cigar and ash. I put it out and told him I was going to wait by the docks for the boat. He nodded and I started to walk away. After a few steps he said, "Hey." I turned around to look at him and he said, "Don't come back here." I turned around and started walking again. I don't know if it was a warning or just a friendly suggestion, but I took it to heart. I was definitely not coming back to Rock Island. When I looked up Keepers of the Flame, as it pertained to Rock Island, I found 3 things that he could have been referring to. The name of the Native Americans that lived on the island, the Potawatomi, could be translated to Keepers of the Flame. The lighthouse keepers on the island were sometimes referred to as the Keepers of the Flame. Then there was also a 19th century cult that was said to visit the island from time to time. They called themselves the Keepers of the Flame. I know that hundreds of people visit Rock Island every year and do have a great time camping, hiking the trails and exploring Chester Thordarson's buildings, but my humble suggestion is do not go to Rock Island. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's collection of camping stories, and if of course you did, feel free to leave me a comment down below, or a like, either help, and it really means the world. I'd like to extend a special thank you as always to my members and patrons who help financially support the channel. If this is something you're interested in, you can find information in the description. You get benefits including stuff sent to you every 3 months on Patreon, Mort's Minis, a mini podcast that I'm doing for members and patrons only. You can find it on either platform, and a whole bunch of other exclusive content too. You can find the links down below if that is something that you are interested in. But for now, I'm going to wrap things up here. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you'd like more, there are more on screen. But until then, stay awesome and I'll see you in the next one.